Hello, and welcome back to Modes of Reasoning 1730B, the only Modes of Reasoning course that takes place on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. This week's topic is complex arguments. I'm going to be talking about what complex arguments are, how to reconstruct them, and how to evaluate them. And I'm also going to be talking about how to evaluate arguments more generally. Since the best way to explain the skills of argument analysis is through examples, a big chunk of this lecture is going to be me doing an analysis of an extended argument in a text. A familiar looking text, in fact. Now, I already introduced you to the concept of complex arguments in, I think, lecture number 3. So let's begin with the clip from that lecture.
What I didn't say last time is that sometimes there are reasons given in support of reasons. A complex argument is an argument where you give reasons for the reasons. A good way of thinking about the process of argument, you can think of argument as a process. It's helpful to think of argument as a process. You can think of it as giving reasons why something is true, then giving reasons to think that the reasons are true, and so on. Another helpful way of thinking about argument is as a dialogue in which you're trying to convince them of a position, and then they ask, well, why should I believe that? And then you give them a reason or reasons, and then they go, well, why should I believe that? And you give reasons for that, and so on. Okay, on the next slide, I have an example of argument as dialogue. Somebody help me out here. I would like somebody to engage in this dialogue, so I need somebody to do the you part, and I'll do the reader part. Volunteers? The class is so much less boring when it's not just me talking.
I'll volunteer, that's fine.
Okay, you go first.
The best way for the federal government to improve a sluggish economy is to give tax credits to its poorest citizens.
Why should I believe that?
This will put money in their pockets, which they will then spend. This surge in spending will lead to more jobs.
Why should I believe that?
Businesses will be taking in more money, and because they're selling more stuff, they'll need to hire more people to produce, transport, and sell it.
Okay, but why should I believe that?
Well, it's just common sense, isn't it? And if you don't believe me, go read economist Paul Krugman's blog. He won the Nobel Prize in economics, so he knows what he's talking about.
Okay, but why give tax credits only to the poorest citizens? Why not give them to everyone?
We can't give tax breaks to everyone because the government still needs tax revenue to function. The poorest people are the ones who have trouble meeting their day-to-day expenses. They will be forced to spend the money right away, whereas better off people may invest it or put it into savings.
Okay, great, thank you. So I hope everybody got from that the idea of how an argument is a matter of supporting a thesis by giving reasons or answering the question, why should I believe that? Here is the same argument in, this is how it would look if you wrote it on an essay, for example. It's a paragraph. Take a moment and read it. I'm not going to read it out loud. So as you can see, this version contains all of the same information as the first version. It just happens to be in essay form. And where in the dialogue, somebody directly referenced Paul Krugman and said who he is, and the equivalent of doing that in an essay, of course, is to put in a citation or a footnote, which you can see here. Here's the footnote there. Why did I put it in brackets instead of the way a footnote normally looks? Well, it's easier to see. Are there any questions on that? Like I was saying, you start off with your thesis, which is the claim that you're trying to prove. Here it is at the apex of the pyramid. Below that, because they're supporting it, are your premises or reasons in support of your thesis, right? They're supporting it, which is why they're underneath. And these reasons or premises are in turn supported by other reasons or premises, which are the third level of the pyramid down here. Do you see how it works? Now you'll notice that in this diagram, the claims in support of your conclusion are referred to as arguments. That's a little confusing in the sense that the whole thing is an argument. All of this is one argument. These are what you call subordinate arguments. A subordinate argument is what happens when you provide reasons in support of other reasons. So you can think of what in the pyramid diagram, it's called your arguments. These you can think of as like your main premises. And these main premises are supported by other premises, which down here are called your supporting data. And because you have your data supporting a claim here, this is also an argument, right? The whole thing together is an argument because an argument is one claim which is supported by other claims. So this whole thing is an argument, but likewise, you can zoom in on what's called argument one over here. And as you can see, this has the same sort of pyramid structure. It has it's a claim which is supported by other claims. So we speak of these as the subordinate arguments. A subordinate argument is like an argument nested within an argument.
Now, complex argument, I should probably mention this, complex argument doesn't mean complicated argument. A complex argument isn't necessarily complicated. Complex argument is a term from logic, and in it, the word complex refers to something with multiple parts. So, for example, I live in a townhouse complex instead of on the bridge of the Enterprise. I work on the bridge of the Enterprise, but I live in a townhouse complex. Anyway, a townhouse complex is several different buildings that make up this one thing, the group of townhouses, which are various homes. Ooh, can you hear that noise? That noise is a motorized cat toy. Please excuse me. As I was saying, not all complex arguments are complicated. Some are quite simple, like the example that we looked at in the clip from the third lecture. Some of them may seem complicated, but once you reconstruct them into premises and conclusions, they're not complicated anymore. I mean, most of them. I can't remember if I've told you this before, but argument reconstruction is just a sort of technical term that I find useful for describing the process of taking an argument that's presented in the form of a text, a normal text, sentences and paragraphs, or maybe a visual text or multimedia argument, and putting it in the form of premises and conclusions. The purpose is to represent as clearly and unambiguously as possible the logical relationships between the premises and the conclusion, and also between the premises and other premises. I like the word reconstruction. It has the sense of taking something apart into its components and then putting it back together again, which is what you're doing. It's more than just finding premises and conclusions, because you normally have to rephrase them, and also sometimes you have to add implicit premises. It's a bit like reverse engineering, if you're familiar with that concept. That's where you take apart a piece of technology in order to figure out how it works. You're taking apart the text in order to figure out how the argument in the text works. Now, you might be wondering why you have to understand how to reconstruct complex arguments. And the answer is most arguments are complex. All the texts that I've given you for the critical reading assignments have contained complex arguments, except possibly for the one that was a cartoon. Most texts that are more than a single paragraph in length are going to contain complex arguments. The ones that contain arguments at all, I mean. The arguments that I've given you to illustrate different forms of inference and stuff like that have mostly been simple arguments, but that's because they were illustrations. And they're going to be more effective illustrations if you don't have to worry about the argument being complex, right? Normally, when we're trying to show you a new thing in a course, we show you the simplest version of that thing, and later we move on to the more complex versions. I'm sure you're familiar with this notion. I think that the best way to explain why figuring out how to reconstruct complex arguments is important, and also a good use of our time in the course, is to talk about people who did it wrong. Let's talk about people reconstructing arguments not good. In the past, sometimes as part of a larger assignment, I'd ask students to reconstruct the argument in a text of around a page or a couple of pages in length, sometimes longer. And some people would do it correctly, and that's great. But usually, when I did this, some people would give me a huge long list of numbered premises, like, say, around 20 premises, followed by a conclusion. So what they did was they went through the text and picked out every sentence that sounded to them like it could be a premise, and then wrote it down in a numbered list. Perhaps they thought that was what they were supposed to do. But I think you can see how that's not particularly helpful for understanding the argument in terms of how the parts fit together. And if you don't understand how the parts of an argument fit together, then you don't understand the argument. There's never going to be an argument where there are 10 premises or 20 premises or some other large number of premises, all directly supporting the conclusion with no other organization to them. Arguments don't work that way. Some of the premises, if you have a bunch of them, are going to be supporting other premises. There are going to be subordinate arguments. They might even be using different forms of inference. Remember, I don't teach something in this course unless I think it's a skill you can use either in your other courses, in real life, or both. I want you to be able to evaluate arguments, which means to judge whether you should be persuaded by them or not. That sounds useful, right? Like arguments are the things by which we decide what to believe or what to do. It's the most generally useful skill you can have. And you can't evaluate an argument if you don't know how its parts fit together. For example, maybe something that you've picked out as a premise doesn't support the main conclusion, and instead it supports a subordinate conclusion. Then, when you're evaluating the argument, you're going to say that this premise is irrelevant because it doesn't support the main conclusion. You'll think there's something wrong with the premise or wrong with the argument. But in reality, this premise might be really important to the argument because it's there to support another one of the premises, a subordinate conclusion, which then supports the main conclusion. Get it? In fact, the method I'm going to be recommending for evaluating complex arguments involves evaluating each one of the subordinate arguments first independently. You can't do that if you don't know what the subordinate arguments are. So how do you do it? Well, the first step in reconstructing a complex argument is the same as with a simple argument. Figure out what the conclusion is. Or I should say main conclusion, since a complex argument will also have subordinate conclusions, meaning premises that are supported by other premises that also act in support of another premise or the main conclusion. This isn't usually difficult, finding the main conclusion, I mean. In fact, the longer the text that you're dealing with, the easier it should be to find a main conclusion. Usually. Longer texts have more words in them that they can use to tell you what they're trying to convince you of. Longer texts will normally tell you what the main conclusion is instead of having an implied conclusion, as short arguments might. These techniques of how to reconstruct an argument are meant to go with the critical reading techniques. You can think of them as an extension of the critical reading techniques, or you can think of the critical reading techniques as a preamble to reconstructing the argument. If you do a critical reading of a text, these techniques that you see here on the screen, before you reconstruct it, you will probably get a bunch of clues as to what the main conclusion is, what some of the premises are, and possibly even how they're organized. I'm going to show you what I mean when we do the example. Often you can figure out what the main conclusion is from the title of the text. Also, the context might help. And where longer texts are concerned, there's likely to be various bits of information in the text that communicate to you how it's organized. We call these signposts. For instance, you might be aware of the 5-paragraph essay format. If you're not, doesn't matter, but some of you do, so I'm going to use this as an example. So like the 5-paragraph essay format is like you have an introductory paragraph and 3 body paragraphs and a concluding paragraph. I don't want you to use this 5-paragraph format when you write essays in this course, by the way. And we'll talk more about that when we're talking about writing essays, but I don't want you to use that format. I'm just talking about it right now because in order to make a point about figuring out the organization of the argument in a text. So your 5-paragraph essay format has an introductory paragraph, right? And the introductory paragraph is supposed to contain a summary of your argument. So that summary will help you to understand what's going on in those 3 paragraphs, right? And likewise, in longer texts, like articles, things that are several pages long, there's almost always going to be an introductory paragraph or a couple of introductory paragraphs. I mean, if it's long enough, there may be a whole introductory section. And in there, the author will tell you what they're arguing for, and they will give you some sense of how the argument is laid out in the rest of the text. In the 5-paragraph essay, each of those 3 body paragraphs is supposed to contain one argument, right? And that's like pretty common. It's not uncommon for authors to organize essays so that each subordinate argument is contained within its own paragraph. Longer texts may have sections, like if they're several pages long, they might have, part 1, part 2, part 3, and it's also likely that this will reflect the organization of the arguments. Sometimes there's a paragraph where the author just stops and says, okay, this is what I'm going to do in the next section, or this is what I'm going to do in the rest of the article. Here's how the following parts fit together. It'll be like sort of a map to the rest of it. And you can also find signposts within the paragraph. That's where they say things like, I am now going to explain why I think this is true, or here's why I think this, or there are 3 reasons to think this, here is the first one, and so on. Stuff like that. Look out for stuff like that. You can circle that stuff when you're doing your close reading out of the pre-reading techniques, number 3 here. One thing that I have found very useful in reconstructing complex argument is what I call argument strategies. What is an argument strategy? Well, it's a term that I use for the choices that the author makes on a fundamental organizational level about how to best support the conclusion. It's not the same thing as form of inference at all. An argument strategy is also not a formal pattern, like with a deductive argument. It is a way for us to understand what the argument is doing, the different steps of the argument. You see, it's useful to understand not just the information that the author is giving to support their position, but also the method, how those reasons are supposed to work together in order to support the conclusion. The vast majority of complex arguments you run into will use one of 2 argument strategies, and I'm going to show you 3. More than 3 argument strategies exist. There are more than 3 different kinds of argument strategies. I can think of 5 just off the top of my head. But what I'm going to do is show you the 2 most common ones and one less common one. And like I said, it's likely that when you're presented with a complex argument and an op-ed, a journal article, something like that, it's most likely that it's going to be either number 1 or number 2. So the argument strategies that I'm going to talk about in this lecture are 1, single main argument with subordinate conclusions, 2, multiple independent arguments, and 3, nested arguments. So in the first kind that you see here on the screen, you have a conclusion supported by a number of premises, right? You know how that works. But some of these premises, sometimes all of them, sometimes just some of them, have premises in support of them, as in the example here. Here we have an argument for the conclusion we should legalize prostitution with regulation, right? Main conclusion here at the bottom. And there are 3 premises in support of this conclusion. Number 1, we must either legalize prostitution with regulation or legalize it without regulation or allow it to remain illegal. So that premise is laying out like the 3 available options, right? Premise number 2, we should not allow it to remain illegal. Premise number 3, we should not legalize it without regulation. Well, if our options are either legalize it with regulation or legalize it without regulation or allow it to remain illegal, and we shouldn't allow it to remain illegal, and we should not legalize it without regulation, well then if all of these premises are true, then the conclusion that follows is we should legalize it with regulation. This is a deductive argument, and it's very similar to one of the valid deductive argument patterns that we looked at in a previous lecture, and that deductive argument pattern is called disjunctive argument. The disjunctive argument is either A or B, not A, therefore B, right? First premise gives you a choice between two options, and the second premise says not the second option, or sometimes not the first option, and therefore the conclusion is the other option. This is the same as that, only it gives you three options, so it has to say not the second option and not the third option, right? Now, the first premise seems to be pretty intuitive, like, okay, when it comes to this social issue, this thing that is illegal, we can do nothing and allow it to remain illegal. That's one option. Or we can make it legal. That's a second option. But that second option splits into two, right? With regulation or without regulation. So, this seems to be outlining all of the options. Makes sense to me. But what about the second two premises? We should not allow it to remain illegal, and we should not legalize it without regulation. Why should we believe those things? Well, helpfully, the argument has provided the premises that we need to answer that question. It has these premises here, P4, P5, and P6, which tell us why we should believe we shouldn't allow it to remain illegal. And we have premises P7 and P8, which tell us why we shouldn't legalize it without regulation. Let's have a look. So do you remember the argument dialogue? So imagine, I said we should legalize prostitution with regulation. And you said, why should I believe that? And then I gave you these reasons. And then you said, well, why should I believe that we shouldn't allow it to remain illegal? My response to that is the premises in support of premise two. If we allow prostitution to remain illegal, then prostitutes will continue to be afraid to seek police protection. If they continue to be afraid to seek police protection, then they will continue to suffer abuse. And we should not allow prostitutes to continue to suffer abuse. Does that make sense? Now, you may or may not find these reasons to be compelling, but I think you understand how these reasons, P4, P5, and P6, support P2. This is an argument for why we should not allow prostitution to remain illegal. Now, let's look at the premises in support of premise number 3. If we legalize prostitution without regulation, then human trafficking will increase. We should not let human trafficking increase. Therefore, fill in the blank. So you see how this works, right? What you have is a sort of like a main argument, a sort of skeleton. If you can think of the argument strategy as a skeleton, then the spine, the spine, I was going to say the spinal cord, but that's a nerve thing. That's not part of the skeleton. Like the spine of the argument is P1, P2, and P3, as I have represented them here on the screen. P1, P2, P3, main conclusion. That's the main argument. There is an argument in support of premise number 2, and you can see that here in the diagram. P4 plus P5 leads to P2. And there's also P6 and P7, which lead to P3. So single main argument with a subordinate argument coming in here, and another subordinate argument coming in here. This is what we call an argument diagram, or sometimes argument map. Argument diagrams are useful for understanding and showing the organization of a complex argument in cases where just putting it in standard form is not enough. So if you look on like the left side, of the screen here where it says either A or B or C, not A, not B, therefore C. That is the structure of the argument on the previous page. See? We must either A or B or C. We should not one of them, we should not the other one, therefore the thing. This is simply that, only stripped down to its structure without the content, like a deductive argument pattern. It is, in fact, a deductive argument pattern. But this only represents the main argument. There isn't a way that we can show how the subordinate arguments fit in without doing something like what you see on the right-hand side, the argument diagram. Well, I suppose you can, because that's what I did on the previous page, right? I use these arrows and these boxes. So this, I guess this is also a kind of argument diagram, but this takes up a lot of space. If the argument is more complicated than this, you're not going to be able to fit it all in. And it's useful to understand what the structure is without necessarily having the content. And that's what you have here on the right. You have the structure, and you just have the numbers of the premises instead of the premises themselves. So you can see at a glance how this fits together, right? P1, P2, and P3 support the main conclusion. P4 and P5 support P2. And P6 and P7 support P3. P1, P2, and P3 are the main argument, and the other two are the supporting arguments. And I think that's represented pretty succinctly by the argument diagram. This is what argument diagrams are for. But that's not the only way to organize a complex argument. Some complex arguments don't have a main argument. They have a number of separate arguments, each one of it which are just as main as the other one. They work independently, as you can see here on the screen. So the one on the left, so the main conclusion is aggression is biologically caused. And there are 3 subordinate arguments in support of this conclusion. The first one is on the right. Genetic and hereditary factors play a major role in aggression. And there's 2 premises in support of that, which I'm not going to bother to read out. Pretty sure I've showed you this particular argument diagram before. There's also a second subordinate argument in the middle. Alterations in human biochemistry also have an effect on aggression. This also has a couple of premises in support of it. And there's also the one on the right. Each one of these supports the main conclusion, and none of them is really subordinate to any other. This could work in a couple of different ways, as shown by the 2 diagrams here on the screen. The one on the right works like the one on the previous page here, where there are 3 subordinate arguments in support of the main conclusion. The one on the right actually could be an argument diagram of the one on the previous page. The difference being the one on the previous page has the conclusion at the top and the premises below it. This one flows in the opposite direction, and normally in argument diagrams, the direction of inference will be downward. They will flow downward, like in standard argument form, the conclusion is on the bottom. Well, in an argument diagram, normally is to have the main conclusion on the bottom and the direction of inference flowing downward. That's indicated by the premises stacked on top of each other here, but also the arrows that go from the conclusion, no, the arrows that go from the premise to the conclusion that it supports. We infer from premises to conclusions, and that's represented by an arrow pointing from the premise to the conclusion. Now, how are these two different? Well, the one on the right has three subordinate arguments with their own subordinate conclusions. The one on the left does not have the subordinate conclusions. So the one on the right works like this one here on the previous page, where you can see there's a subordinate conclusion here with its own premises, subordinate conclusion here with its own premises, and one here as well. Why is this one in red? I'll get back to you on that. So the diagram here on the left works a little bit differently. In this one, you have three arguments and you have three subordinate arguments, and the conclusion of each one of the subordinate arguments is the main conclusion. You remember a little while ago, I was talking about the 5-paragraph essay where each of your body paragraphs contains an argument for your conclusion or thesis. So you have three separate arguments, all in support of your one conclusion. Well, that's what's going on here. There are no intermediary subordinate conclusions, but we represent it like this, separating out the three different arguments because they are different and they are independent. They all support the main conclusion independently. And that is how it is different from the previous one that we looked at, what did I call it? The single main argument with subordinate arguments. So on the right, we have three subordinate arguments, each one of which has a subordinate conclusion, which is different from the main conclusion, but which provides support for the main conclusion. The one on the left doesn't have subordinate conclusions. It has three arguments, each one of which has as its conclusion the main conclusion. There are no intermediary subordinate conclusions, but it still makes sense to represent them as three separate arguments because they work independently rather than together. So P1 and P2 work together in a way that they don't work together with P3 and P4 or P5 and P6, and so it is with the other two. I hope that makes sense. I should say that there's nothing special about the number 3. You don't have to have 3 subordinate arguments. You can have 2, you can have 4. Longer texts may have more than that. 3 is just convenient for representing it in the form of a diagram. It's also possible to have a mix of the version on the left and the version on the right. Let's say you have 2 subordinate arguments. One of them may support the main conclusion directly, as in the diagram on the left, but the second one might have a subordinate conclusion, which then supports the main conclusion as like the one on the right. So these can be mixed, right? So one of them could be P1, P2, directly supporting the main conclusion and another subordinate argument which has a subordinate conclusion. That can also happen. So like I said before, those are the 2 most common argument strategies. There are more argument strategies than these, but the majority of texts containing complex arguments that you're going to look at will follow one of these 2 strategies. Thinking about the texts that I have used in the course for the papers in the past, almost all of them used one of these strategies. But there's a third, less common strategy that I want to show you anyway for reasons that I think will become clear. I call this nested arguments, and the way it works is like this. You have like your main argument, so that's your main conclusion with some premises in support of that, and inside that argument, you have an argument for one of the premises, and inside that argument, you have another argument in support of one of those premises. So it's an argument inside an argument inside an argument, like those Russian nesting dolls. I've tried to represent that in these two diagrams here. Both of them faithfully depict the structure of the argument on the previous page, but the one on the right, in my opinion, does a better job of showing how this works, and in particular, how it is an argument within an argument within an argument. So let's go back to the argument dialogue model of complex arguments, where you make a claim, and then I ask you, why should I believe that? And you give me a reason, and then I say, well, why should I believe that? And then you give a reason for the reason, right? That's a subordinate argument. Then after you've given the reason for the reason, I can say, well, why should I believe that? And you give me a reason for a reason for a reason. And that's kind of what you have here, right? So here's your main argument, and there are three premises. But as you can see, there's a subordinate argument in support of one of these three premises. Why is it three premises with only one of the premises having a subordinate argument in support of it? Well, a couple of reasons. The first reason is that is the argument that this is a map of. The argument on the previous page, here, we'll look at it in a moment. The argument on the previous page has three premises. Two of them don't have support. One of them does have support, which is this one here. So it's calling it subordinate conclusion 5. There are two reasons given in support of subordinate conclusion 5, which are SC3 and P4. And as you can see, there are a couple of reasons given in support of SC3. So taking it from the top, you have 1 and 2 in support of 3, right? So claim number 3 is a subordinate conclusion, meaning it's a conclusion with respect to the first two premises, but it's also acting as a premise with respect to what comes after. So you have P1 and P2 in support of 3, then you have 3 and 4 in support of 5, and then you add to 5 premise 6 and premise 7 to get to the main conclusion. So you have your main argument here, main conclusion with premises in support of it, and an argument in support of one of the premises here, and an argument in support of one of the premises that supports one of the premises. So there are 3 layers. So if you compare it to this one, there's only 2 layers of argument. There are the premises that directly support your main conclusion, and there are premises in support of those premises. This one works the same way, or in a similar way, but it also has premises in support of the supporting premises. So the first argument strategy that I showed you had a position and then reasons for that position. And it also had reasons for the reasons. Well, this one is like that, but it just takes it one step further. It has the position with reasons, and reasons for one of the reasons, and reasons for one of the reasons for the reasons. And of course, it doesn't always have to be 2 reasons in support of a reason. It could be 3, it could be 1, it could be 5. Perhaps it will be clearer if we look at an actual argument instead of just the diagram of an argument. So here's my example. It's not a very good example. And it's not a very good example because, like I said before, this argument strategy is less common, and I wasn't really able to find a good example that fit my purposes. This one is from way back in 1984, and it's a bit dated, as you can probably tell from the title, Why Homosexuality is Abnormal. I wouldn't call it a good argument, In fact, what I would call it is, well, cringe. It's sort of equal parts funny and offensive. So if homophobia is something triggering for you, I recommend skipping this part and moving on to the next bit. And I will try to insert a timestamp to where you can skip to. Premise one. Removing all your teeth and wearing them as a necklace is using organs for a purpose other than for which they were designed. Premise two, removing all your teeth and wearing them as a necklace is harmful. Conclusion, or rather subordinate conclusion, using organs for a purpose other than for which they were designed is harmful. Yes, this is a real argument that was published in a real philosophy journal, and it was in fact reprinted a number of times. Yes, it's ridiculous, but that's not my fault. So you have two premises in support of a conclusion. The conclusion is using organs for a purpose other than for which they were designed is harmful. And he tries to show that by giving you an example, which is removing all of your teeth and wearing them as a necklace, which is not something that anyone would ever do. Why does he choose this as an example? I guess it was because he couldn't think of a better example to illustrate his point. This argument is not valid, by the way. It has the same form as all dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all dogs are cats. It's not a valid argument, but it is the argument that he gives. I promise you that I am not misrepresenting him. So you can probably guess where this is going. This next premise is homosexuals use their sex organs for a purpose other than that for which they were designed. Yes, I told you it was cringe. So first, see, the argument proceeds in a series of steps, right? So first, he tries to show that using an organ for a purpose other than for which it was designed is harmful, and he supports this, or I should say, he attempts to support this with the rather fanciful example of pulling out all of your teeth and wearing them as a necklace. So in that case, you're using your teeth for decoration instead of for chewing food. And this is harmful because, well, you can't eat solid food at that point. Well, unless you get false teeth. I told you, it's not a very good argument. It's not my fault. Stop bothering me. So he wants to convince us that using your organs for a purpose other than for which they are designed is bad. That's the first step. Then he adds, gay people use their sex organs for a purpose other than that for which they were designed, which I assume is reproduction. Well, I don't assume that. He actually says it in the text. This is from an article, remember. So if using your organs for a purpose other than for which they were designed is harmful, and if being gay means that you use your organs for a purpose other than for which they were designed, if both of these things are true, then it would follow that being gay is harmful. Okay. So the next thing he says is that if we legitimize harmful behavior, more people will engage in it. And we don't want more people to engage in harmful behavior. Therefore, we should not legitimize homosexuality. This is not, as you might think, an argument against legalizing gay marriage. Remember, this is from 1984. He was actually making an argument against gay rights more generally. He's making an argument, oh, well, maybe we should keep all of those those old laws that make homosexuality illegal. Or maybe we shouldn't have laws saying that you're not allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation. That's what he was arguing for. Even in 1984, this was a pretty regressive argument. So that was kind of embarrassing. But the point is, the argument works by first, he has some premises that establish a thing, and then he adds another premise, and those together establish another thing, and then he adds another premise to establish a third thing. So it's like an argument nested inside an argument, nested inside another argument. The three layers, it is the structure that you see on this page here. Now I want to return to the second argument, the one that aggression is biologically caused. You remember how there were three subordinate conclusions in support of the main conclusion, and one of them was red, the one on the right here. And I said I would tell you why it's red when the other ones are green. Well, the reason why it's red is because it's not actually a subordinate conclusion. Sorry, I lied. What it is an objection. It is actually a reason not to believe the main conclusion, that aggression is biologically caused. It says, the human environment influences aggressive tendencies. And as you can see, that is a reason to think that aggression is not biologically caused. What's going on here? Why would somebody put in a reason against their main conclusion as part of an argument? Well, I'll explain. In longer texts, it's quite common for authors to consider objections and counterarguments. Objections and counterarguments you can think of as reasons for the other side of the argument. Why would somebody put those in? Well, you can make your argument stronger by anticipating objections that other people might have, by anticipating problems people might have with your conclusion or with your premises and answering them. There are a variety of ways that you can answer an objection or a counter-argument. For example, you can show that the counter-argument is flawed. You can show that the objection doesn't actually apply to the part of your argument that it is objecting to. So the difference between objections and counter-arguments, like sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. And sometimes I will say, you should consider objections when I really mean objections and counter-arguments, but I'll explain the difference between the two very briefly now. Like it says on the slide, an objection is a putative problem with part of your argument. So if somebody has a problem with one of your premises, they think that one of your premises might be flawed, that's called an objection. A counter-argument is an argument against your conclusion. So that's what we have here. Not here. Here. So the claim, the human environment influences aggressive tendencies, that functions as an argument against the thesis of the argument or the article or the essay that this is a diagram of. Hopefully you see how that works. The reason why people consider objections and counterarguments is because arguments don't exist in a vacuum. I alluded to this a few weeks ago when we talked about proposal arguments. You could have an argument or even a couple of arguments for your position that in isolation seem pretty strong. But what if there exists out there somewhere one or more arguments against your position? Well, if those exist, then it's possible that your reader knows about them. So your reader might be reading your argument and going, well, okay, yes, I accept this and I accept this and I understand that. But what about this problem which you haven't mentioned? Okay? So, in order to deal with the situation of what about this problem that you haven't mentioned, what an author might do is mention the problem and then deal with it in some way. They don't bring up a counterexample, or I'm sorry, they don't bring up a counter argument or an objection to make their argument look weaker. They bring it up because they think that a reader might bring that up themselves, and they're going to answer it in the text before the reader has a chance to bring it up. So you only bring up objections and counter arguments when you are able to answer them, when you're able to diffuse them, so to speak, when you're able to show that, for example, there's a flaw with this argument against your position. So you show how this counter argument is flawed, and that makes your argument look stronger than it would have if you hadn't considered the counter argument, or likewise someone could point out a problem with one of your premises, and then you could anticipate that by saying, now, you might think that there is problem X with premise Y, but as a matter of fact, problem X doesn't actually apply to premise Y, and I'll explain why. So that's why you see objections and counter arguments in some texts. If you're reconstructing an argument in a text and the text has objections and counter arguments, I don't want you to include the objections and the counter arguments as part of your reconstruction. Just stick to the argument or arguments for the thesis or the main conclusion in the text. Don't worry about this other thing where the author is dealing with potential problems, okay? So now that you know that that is a thing that can happen, you're prepared for it, and the way you deal with it is by not dealing with it. You set it aside. It is not part of the process of reconstructing the argument. So there you go. So what I'd like to do now is to demonstrate the process of reconstructing a complex argument by taking one of the texts that I used to demonstrate the critical reading techniques. So it's a text that we've seen before, and reconstruct the argument in it. Full disclosure, I have already shot that part, and it's pretty long. So this lecture is going to be one of the longer, if not the longest, one of the longest weeks of lectures that I've done in this course. I'm probably going to be uploading it in 3 parts instead of 2, because Zoom is a bit fussy and doesn't like it when I try to upload videos of longer than 60 minutes in length. So I'm sorry about how long this is going to turn out to be, but I do like to be thorough, and I think in this case, it's worth it.